Girl, 6, calls 911 on own parents. Police shocked when they realize why. The night air hung heavy over the quiet town of Maple Ridge. Rain tapped against the windows of the police station, steady and cold. Officer Daniel Harris sat alone at his desk, staring at the glowing screen of his computer, half listening to the hum of the vending machine in the corner. It was supposed to be an uneventful Tuesday evening. Then the radio cracked to life. A child's voice came through dispatch, thin and trembling. A girl, no older than 6. She said her parents wouldn't wake up. The dispatcher tried to ask questions, but the line filled with static before cutting out. Daniel straightened in his chair, his pulse quickening. He reached for his jacket and keys, without a word. The address was on the far edge of town, a small house surrounded by woods. As he drove, the rain thickened, turning the road into a blur of dark reflections. Streetlights passed like brief flashes of gold through the windshield. His partner, Officer Laura Reed, sat quietly beside him, scanning the information on her tablet. The details were few. No background on the family, no previous calls. Just one line that kept echoing in Daniel's mind. Caller states parents are unresponsive. When they turned onto Maplewood Lane, the neighborhood was silent. No porch lights, no movement behind windows. The only sound was the low growl of the engine and the hiss of rain against the roof. Daniel slowed near the end of the street. A single small house stood there, its windows dark, a faint shape moving behind the glass. He stepped out of the cruiser, rain soaking through his sleeves in seconds. His flashlight beam cut through the mist, landing on a tiny figure standing in the doorway. A little girl in pink pajamas. She held something close to her chest, a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. Her bare feet pressed against the wet wooden step. For a moment, everything went still. The only movement was the wind pushing at the trees and the faint tremble of the child's shoulders. Daniel exchanged a look with Laura, then slowly approached the porch. The girl didn't speak. She just looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. And then softly, she said, "They can't talk." The recording of the 911 call played softly in the background of Daniel's thoughts as he stood in the doorway. A child's voice, quiet and unsure, asking for help. The dispatcher's questions had been simple, but every answer made the air feel heavier. The girl had said her name was Emily. She said her mommy and daddy couldn't talk. She said they wouldn't wake up. Inside the house, the smell was faint but strange, like something old and stale had settled in the air. Daniel paused on the threshold, scanning the dim room. A couch stood in the corner, a coffee cup knocked over on the table. The television glowed with the soft blue of a paused cartoon, frozen mid-frame. Everything looked normal, yet wrong in a way that made the skin prickle on the back of his neck. Emily stood a few steps behind him, still clutching the blanket. Her small arms trembled under the weight of the baby she carried. Daniel noticed the way she held the infant close, his face buried against her shoulder, his tiny hand peeking from the folds of the blanket. Laura took the baby gently from her, checking for signs of harm, but the child only whimpered once before falling quiet. Daniel crouched to meet Emily's eyes. She didn't cry. Her expression was distant, almost dazed, as if she had been waiting for someone to finally show up. He asked her where her parents were. Without saying a word, she pointed toward the living room. Daniel followed her gaze. On the far side of the room, 2 figures lay motionless on the floor. A man and a woman. No visible injuries, no signs of struggle, just stillness. The girl's words echoed again. They can't talk. Laura's hand went to her mouth. Daniel moved closer, scanning for any clue of what had happened. The silence inside the house pressed down around them, thick and uneasy. The only sound was the soft ticking of a wall clock somewhere down the hall. He turned back to Emily, who stood by the doorway, small and pale under the dim light. She looked up at him and whispered, almost as if it hurt to speak, "Are they going to wake up now?" Daniel moved quickly across the living room, his boots silent on the carpet. The air felt thick, almost damp, and each breath seemed heavier than the last. He knelt beside the woman first. Her skin was pale, her lips slightly parted. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck and waited. A faint pulse fluttered beneath his touch. The man beside her had one too, weak but there. Laura stepped inside, keeping the baby wrapped in the blanket. She looked around, frowning. The lamps were off, the curtains drawn tight. It felt like the house hadn't been opened to fresh air in days. She spoke softly, her voice careful not to startle the little girl standing by the doorway. Emily didn't move. She kept her eyes on her parents, her small hands twisting the hem of her pajama top. Daniel called out for any response from the adults, but neither moved. He glanced toward the kitchen and saw a dinner plate still on the table, food untouched. It looked as if they'd just stopped in the middle of life. Laura opened a few windows, letting in a cold rush of rain-soaked air. It did little to clear the heavy feeling pressing against their chests. Daniel's flashlight beam swept across the floor and landed on the hallway door. It was slightly open, and from somewhere beyond it came a low, irregular sound, like air pushing through a crack. He stepped closer, squinting into the shadows. The noise was faint but steady, a whisper against the silence of the house. His stomach tightened. He turned back toward Laura. She nodded without a word. Outside, the faint wail of approaching sirens broke the stillness. Emily's head turned toward the sound, her eyes wide but unreadable. Daniel knelt again beside her, steadying his voice. He told her the helpers were coming. She didn't answer, just held her arms close to her chest, rocking a little where she stood. When the first flash of red lights washed across the walls, Daniel exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The tension in the room didn't lift. If anything, it deepened. Whatever had happened here wasn't over yet. Something unseen still lingered in the air. The paramedics rushed through the front door, their boots thudding against the wooden floor. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls as they moved past Daniel and Laura toward the two adults on the ground. Oxygen masks were pulled from bags, soft commands filled the air. The quiet house suddenly became a scene of controlled urgency. Daniel stepped back, watching as they worked. One of the medics called out a reading, another adjusted a valve. Whatever was happening to the parents, it wasn't visible, but it was serious. Emily stood near the open window, clutching the blanket that had covered her baby brother. Her small face was expressionless, but her eyes followed every movement in the room. Laura stayed beside her, keeping the little girl steady. The baby had begun to fuss softly, and she rocked him until he settled again. The air still carried that faint metallic smell that Daniel couldn't quite place. He rubbed at his temple, feeling a dull ache forming behind his eyes. A firefighter entered from the back of the house, his mask glinting in the light. He spoke to Daniel in a low voice, almost drowned out by the rain outside. The man pointed toward the basement door. Daniel followed him down the short steps, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Pipes lined the walls, old and rusted. A faint hiss filled the space, steady and rhythmic, like breath. The firefighter crouched near a metal unit, running a gloved hand along one of the joints. He leaned close, then looked back up at Daniel and shook his head slowly. Daniel didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He climbed the stairs again, his throat dry, the weight of realization pressing down on him even before anyone said a word. Upstairs, the paramedics were lifting the parents onto stretchers. Emily's small voice broke through the noise. She asked if her mommy and daddy were still sleeping. Daniel knelt beside her again, his face softening. He told her they were very sick, but the helpers were going to make them better. Emily nodded once. Her hands relaxed just a little around the blanket. Outside, the rain began to ease, but the air inside the house still felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. 3 days passed before Daniel saw the little girl again. The hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and coffee, the kind of mix that never really leaves a person's nose. He stopped by the nurse's station, nodding toward the room at the end of the hall. Inside, the Walker family was awake. The mother sat up in bed, pale but smiling weakly. The father lay beside her, his hand resting over hers. Emily sat between them, swinging her legs off the side of the chair. She clutched the same worn blanket she'd been holding that night. When she saw Daniel in the doorway, she smiled shyly. a small dimple pressing into her cheek. Her parents' eyes filled with tears as Daniel stepped closer. The mother reached out and took his hand, her grip still weak but full of gratitude. The doctors had explained everything. A pipe in the furnace had cracked, leaking carbon monoxide through the house. The silent gas had slowly filled every room, stealing air without a sound. The parents had lost consciousness within minutes. If Emily hadn't acted when she did, none of them would have survived. Daniel looked down at her, trying to match the child before him with the tiny, trembling figure on the porch that night. She told him she had called 911 because her parents couldn't talk anymore. She said the air smelled funny, and she remembered what her teacher had told her about calling for help. She had opened a window and wrapped her baby brother in a blanket so he wouldn't get cold. Then she waited. Her mother brushed a hand through Emily's hair, voice breaking as she thanked the officers for coming so quickly. Daniel shook his head and smiled. He told her they had a brave little girl to thank for that. As he left the hospital, the sun was setting behind the trees, turning the windows gold. The air was crisp, clean, and alive with sound again. He stood for a moment in the parking lot, breathing it in. That night, somewhere in Maple Ridge, a little girl slept soundly between her parents, the blanket tucked close around her brother. The danger had passed, and what remained was something rare and quiet: safety and the simple courage of a 6-year-old child.